Welcome back to the Living Wisdom Podcast. Today is a dialogue about the Black Mirror episode 15 Million Merits, and I have a guest I'm very eager to have a discussion about that episode with, whom I'll introduce in a moment. I'd first like to summarize the monologue that precedes this episode, a monologue in which I talked about work and slavery from the viewpoint of three philosophers. And I think that those discussions of work and slavery help understand some of the philosophical ideas at the base of this Black Mirror episode. So the three philosophers that I discussed at more length in that monologue are Aristotle, Hegel, and Marx. So let me just quickly give a summary of those main ideas in order to kickstart this conversation today. In Aristotle, there is a distinction between natural masters and natural slaves, and that involves their relationship to reason. Natural masters have reason, and it's effective in determining how they act, whereas natural slaves do not have reason. It's totally ineffective, if present at all, in their ability to manage their lives. And that's why Aristotle thinks it's in fact just the institution of slavery, because people who are not able to live rational lives can get a kind of surrogate rationality by being dominated or mastered by somebody who is in touch with reason. And reason for Aristotle is what I called in my monologue an activity. I distinguish there between three types of processes: an activity, a practice, and a production. In an activity, properly speaking for Aristotle, the word in Greek is energia. In an activity, you're doing something for its own sake. There's a goal of the activity, but the goal of the activity is the activity itself. And the example I used provisionally is going for a walk after dinner. You're not going to get somewhere. You're not going to the ice cream store. You're rather walking around the block because that is an enjoyable thing in its own right, versus a production or a motion. Sometimes Aristotle says, so kinesis is the word for motion and poiesis is the word for production, but the logic is the same. In that inferior kind of process, you are doing something, a process like walking, but in order to achieve some goal that is outside the process itself. So if you, after dinner, want to get an ice cream, you walk to the ice cream store. The walking is a means to the end of getting the ice cream. It's not the end itself of the activity, whereas in the simple example I've just mentioned, going for a walk simply because you enjoy walking after dinner, that would be more like an activity. And in between the two, for Aristotle, is a practice, a praxis in the Greek. And the best example, I think, that he gives of that is virtuous activity, especially courageous activity on the battlefield, where there is a goal outside of your activity. If you're wielding your sword, the goal is to win the battle. And if you could snap your fingers and win the battle, you would. In the same way that if you could snap your fingers and get the ice cream, because that's the only goal of your walking, you would. But Aristotle thinks also in a praxis, there is something valuable about the activity or the praxis itself. So while you're fighting on the battlefield, you are living part of what he considers to be a full human life, engaging in virtuous activity, and that is itself a goal. So just to summarize, there are activities, properly speaking, and Aristotle thinks the only one that really matches the criterion for an activity is contemplation of God, philosophy at its highest register. That's at the highest point, and at the lowest point in this scheme is production, where you engage in process for some other purpose. The process itself simply means, and then in between is praxis. Well, I found that helpful for understanding the relationship between Hegel and Marx, because Hegel has this point in his history, if you like, of the evolution of human consciousness called the Master-Slave Dialectic. And just very quickly to summarize that already, it was quick in the monologue, very quickly, people seek recognition from each other. And Hegel thinks, for reasons perhaps we'll get into in our discussion, that the ultimate way to achieve recognition is to risk your life in a battle with somebody else. And that battle has one of a few results. Both could kill each other, or one could win. And the way one would win would be the one who lost submitted, so that the winner there was willing to risk his life for victory and showed that he's free of the desire to live at all costs. He submitted that to his desire to assert his freedom, whereas the person who then becomes his slave preferred to live than to be free, and as a result doesn't achieve the recognition that the master achieves out of that battle. Well, slavery then ensues, and the slave is submitted to a regime of production. The master makes him till the fields, the master makes him make his shoes, and so on, and the master gets to enjoy a life rather like what Aristotle described for natural masters, which is, if he's an Aristotelian, he'll devote his time to philosophy and especially to the contemplation of God, while the slave will be tilling the fields and making the shoes and engaging in the productions that will make that masterful philosophical life possible. But Hegel notices in this dialectic that something like making shoes is a craft, and that crafts are like praxes, practices in that Aristotelian scheme I just described, so that the slave is, yes, producing shoes, but is getting some value out of the activity of making shoes, because that is something valuable in its own right. It's achieving a kind of mastery and knowledge over the natural world. So the slave achieves a kind of dignity in work that the master has denied himself by relying on the labor of the slave. And eventually in the story, slaves become, as a class, empowered because of their achievement of that kind of mastery. Now, switching very quickly to Marx, there's an economic shift between Hegel's lifetime and Marx's lifetime, and that's the Industrial Revolution. So that whereas the kind of labor that slaves engaged in Hegel's lifetime and before could be sometimes a practice, that is, they would be making shoes, for example, they would be learning the craft of shoemaking. When you get factories after the Industrial Revolution, most labor now is funneled into these buildings where nobody's doing anything craft-like. They're pulling levers. They're engaging in completely meaningless processes, I should say. So it becomes pure production. The class that is generating the wealth for the master class, in this case, the elites, the economic elites, they are that lower class. They are not gaining mastery over the natural world in a way in which the slave did in Hegel's story. And so as a result, they become alienated in Marx's precise sense. They become alienated from their products, first of all, because they work all day in the factory, and whatever comes out of that factory is not owned by them, but instead owned by the owner of the factory. They become alienated from their labor because their labor is done for the sake of that product and for the sake of that product only, which is then taken away from them. They are not engaging in especially something like the Aristotelian activity, which is something good for its own sake. So their time is taken up producing things that they don't own, and their labor itself is alien from their own nature. So with that background in mind, I'd like to now introduce my guest. This is Dr. J. Lampert, who is a full professor of philosophy at Duquesne University, where I also teach, so we are colleagues in our great department. And he got his PhD in philosophy at the University of Toronto. His specialties are Continental Philosophy and the philosophy of time. He has many specialties, but I asked him of the two, or what would you pick? And for those who are not familiar with the tradition of Continental Philosophy, it is especially German and French philosophy of the 19th and 20th centuries, movements closer to our own time. In Continental Philosophy, names that you may have heard of are phenomenology, existentialism, postmodernism. But many of these movements in the 20th century have their roots in Hegel. And Hegel is one of the many specialties of Dr. J. Lampert, which is the reason that I invited him on today to discuss 15 Million Merits. And I'll finally mention that he's published many things, but most recently in 2018, he published a book called The Many Futures of a Decision. So Jay, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, you know much more about Hegel than I do, so there are so many places we could begin, but I'd like to invite you to begin by talking a bit more about Hegel, perhaps qualifying and explaining some of the things that I said in more detail.
Sure. So I'll just give a bit of a spin on how I summarize the Master-Slave account. And it's only going to be indirectly related to the episode, maybe, because in the episode, there's so little actual recognition among people. And that's probably the point of the episode, to show that the society could develop without recognition, and then everybody's conscious lives get distorted. But so for Hegel's purposes, the quest is for self-knowledge. So the first things we know in general are objects. We see the things around us, but as seeing things around us, we organize them and interpret them. We organize them in space and time and put different elements together and organize them into individual things. And so when we see objects, in a way, we're seeing ourselves. But that's the difficulty, in a way, the paradox is to see ourselves in objects and to see ourselves as objects.
May I just interrupt you very briefly there? I understand that that's a big shift in the history of philosophy, because before you have a strict subject-object dichotomy. So in Descartes, for example, you've got the thinking subject and you've got the inanimate world of material objects. Hegel's saying that it's with our encounter with objects that we become subjects?
Yeah, that's right. And it's also a critique of the mind-body distinction in Descartes.
Yeah.
So in Hegel, in order to know yourself, you have to see yourself as a body. You have to see your mind as embodied, and you have to see bodies as conscious bodies. So in some ways, it's closer to Aristotle than it is to Descartes, where the dualism has become more extreme.
Yes.
But still, for Hegel, there's a paradox in seeing yourself in objects in the world. So when you see a thing in the world, a body, a living thing, it's still you seeing it, but your goal is to see yourself seeing yourself through it.
Yeah, okay.
So you need to see a physical thing, and you need to see it seeing you. And when it sees you, there has to be a sense in which that's you seeing yourself.
I see.
So you have to have others seeing you, but not others that are so others that you don't get self-knowledge out of it.
So you need to encounter other human beings.
You have to encounter other human beings. And so this is the thing. Where are you in the story? So you're the one seeing, you're the one being seen, but you also have to be the one seeing you from the outside. So you have to, in some ways, so this is where the risking your life comes in. So you have to be willing to not just be where you are. You have to give up your point of view and locate it in the other. So
and what's the connection between that and the battle?
And so the next thing is you have to give up yourself to the other. But then when the other sees you, you have to say, no, that's myself seeing me. So you then have to withdraw the independent self from the other as well.
Okay.
So just at the same moment that you sacrifice yourself or give up yourself, that's the moment at which you struggle to take the other self away from them.
And he's doing the same thing to you.
And they're doing the same thing to you.
Okay.
So if it all works and it kind of alternates back and forth, if you like, or if there's some way of recognizing that when you're taking the selves away from each other, you're getting yourself back, then then that would be recognition.
It's all so abstract in Hegel. Do you have any way of making it concrete so that we can imagine how this might play out in a real scenario?
I don't find it abstract at all. That's the way I experience things. So, when you say something to me, I not only do I have to, but I do have that thought myself. So I am always taking over the ideas of the other person and then trying to give it back. So as long as it's a mutual gift, then, that's the situation in marriage and some of the time. That's the situation with, professor and student, or, people running for the bus and there's only room for one, or one person holding the bus for the other person. So there's either in struggle or in cooperative action, there's a kind of sharing of the consciousness.
So just take one of those examples, whichever you like, and just spell it out. So whether it's a person running for the bus or a marriage, just describe in detail. And this might seem repetitive, but it's going to help me certainly, and probably a lot of the listeners, to make it concrete. Just what are the steps of thinking that would happen in that kind of encounter? Take the bus, if you like, since that's so straightforward.
The bus. Well, as you're waiting for the bus, you're seeing another person look around the corner to see if it's coming. So their looking is in some ways you're looking.
Okay.
The irritation at the bus being late is everybody's irritation together.
Yes.
When a new person comes in, just as the bus arrives, we all resent that person for not having waited. So there's all kinds of things that are, some experiences are for all of us. Okay. And some of the experiences are for me, but not for you.
Okay.
And some of the experiences that you have are experiences that I get indirectly, and some of the experiences that I have are resented by somebody else. So there's both the I don't want to quite say sharing, but the relay of experiences from one person to the other, and the question of who really gets to have that experience and who's excluded and who's included from a grouping, and the willingness to not be the only person who's seeing it, but to let the other person seeing be your seeing. And then sometimes the jealousy of not letting the other person's experience be their own, but it has to be yours more exclusively.
Can you explain it? Because I'm having a hard time seeing how there'd be a conflict over this with the bus. Maybe you're able to do it in that case, but you could also switch to another example, like a marriage, where we can imagine
the marriage
conflict.
is too fraught.
Okay.
But in a tennis game,
okay.
there's you hit the ball, but you need to be not just anticipating, but feeling where the other person is going to be getting to the ball, what they're doing before they actually do much of it. You have to see the first shred of their footwork in order to see where they're going to hit the ball back.
Yes.
And so your point is to win the game. Yes. And so your point is to not let them control the point or control the strategy, but you have to be entirely in on their sense of the strategy in order to have that struggle.
Okay, so I get it, that the game makes it clear to me that your goal is to win, and in order to win, you have to not only plan your own strategy, but you have to think about what is the other doing in planning his strategy, and you of course see it in the footwork, as you mentioned,
right.
Which kind of collapses the body-mind distinction, at least in the way that you strategize. But why does it have to be a competition? So clearly the tennis game is a competition, but this is supposed to be an account of human encounter per se. Right. Why is it that we're in competition, and why does conflict, especially to the point of a battle to the death, why is that inevitable?
In the end, you don't want it to be a competition, but in that first moment where you have to not be yourself in order to let the other person be the one who sees you on your behalf, there you have to sacrifice something. And when it's another person seeing you, you can't just make yourself passive or simply objectify yourself so that the other person will have the success. You need to take over that experiencing yourself. So that's the sense in which there's a kind of a conflict or opposition or a taking over from the other, and appropriation of the other is built into the mutual recognition. So in the end, of course, you want to negotiate a situation. You want to create a practice where there's something mutual benefit and mutual recognition comes out of it. Yeah. But there is a moment at which if I'm seeing myself through your eyes, then it's your eyes, and I need to grab that. I need to have it.
So I'll just try and spell out one more example and see if you can elaborate it to make it clearer for me. A couple, we don't have to say a marriage, a couple is going out for dinner and they haven't made a reservation, not sure where they're going to go. So they walk down the street, has a lot of restaurants, and they look at them, and the man is looking at some of the restaurants thinking, I'd like to go there. She's looking at some of the restaurants thinking, I'd like to go here. The man is also thinking, this is the kind of restaurant that she would like. So I'd like to please her. So I'm going to take that into account. She's thinking the same thing about him. It can become infinite, namely.
Right.
But why does the conflict have to arise? That's, I guess, what I'm still driving at.
Right. So Jean-Paul Sartre has really interesting accounts of this in Being in Nothingness, which he puts under the chapter title Sadism and Masochism. And so for him, each moment of it is not just a struggle, but either a subject who tries to make the other person into an object, or a move where you make yourself into the object and let the other person be the subject. In other words, it's either sadistic or masochistic. So over time, it can end up being a negotiated solution that everybody's happy with. But at each instant, when you think, this is the restaurant I want the other person to agree with me. I wish that she had my desires. Yes. Or I'll try to make a deal so that I'm going to win. So at that moment, you're the sadist, you're the subject, they're the object. That's and then you might say to yourself, no, I'm a nice guy. Let her decide today. Right. And then you say, I'll just be the passive one. Let her. But then that's the masochistic one. So you could be both. It's a conflict either way. Yes. And if you decide, okay, today I choose, tomorrow she chooses, it's okay. It works out. Yes. But it's still, each instant is either sadistic or masochistic. So
Yes.
Hegel doesn't really have that, because Hegel's goal is to get yourself to see yourself through the eyes of the other. So not just to objectify the other and make a deal,
Yeah.
but to surrender yourself into the other and to insist that the other surrender yourself into you.
Yeah.
So it's a conflict that's, in a sense, it's a conflict that's resolved every second. It's instantly resolved, but it is a conflict. And if you thought, oh no, we'll just share our consciousness, it doesn't have to be a conflict. We'll each take half of a subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
Then as for Hegel, kind of a wishful thinking to think that you can just be the same as the other person.
I see. Yeah. I mean, does it just get down to this, that you're looking for recognition from an other? And so if you just blend your consciousnesses together, you're not getting recognition from another.
Right, but that's the twist. You have to get your recognition from the other, but the other has to also be you. Otherwise, there's no self-knowledge in it. So
Yeah.
you could get a response from the other. You could get a gift from the other. You can get a word from the other. You only get self-knowledge out of it if you're the other for that moment.
Yeah.
And so you really have to take over from the other. The other really has to be subordinated, not just in terms of their actions, not just because they owe you fidelity, or they owe you a debt or something. They have to give up their consciousness to you. You have to be the one who decides for them. You're their agency. They're just the responsiveness.
Right. Which would make them the slave.
That would make them the slave.
Masochist
Right.
in Sartre's terms. But since they're trying to get self-recognition from
Right.
you, that would make you the slave
Right.
or the masochist. And so there's the
Right.
conflict.
And in a certain sort of primary sense, everybody is both the master and the slave. In fact, you have master and slavery inside of just you. So one part of you is always taking over from another part of you. So the master-slave is inside each consciousness. It's a kind of distributed categories in each person. If a society develops this into a static way, so that some people are always the masters and other people are always the slaves, then you get a real hopeless problem, and then you get master-slave societies.
Yes. So let's try and bring it back to the episode. The moment in this episode that helped me understand Hegel's Master-Slave Dialectic, and we'll see whether I was understanding it correctly or not, is when Bing, having been so disenchanted by what happened to his beloved Abby when she went on stage in the Hot Shots competition, he re-earns his 15 million merits and takes the glass shard that he'd created when he was enraged in his own cell. He smuggles it into the competition, and he performs that very powerful dance, kind of brutal dance, and then stops the whole thing, and then puts the glass shard to his throat and says, "I'll kill myself unless you allow me to say my piece." I see that as an illustration of Hegel's dialectic, as I understand it at any rate, and I'm happy to be corrected, but that he wants recognition for, well, all kinds of things. I think he wants recognition as a subject, most broadly, not just a cog in this societal machine. He wants people to listen to the values that he's come to as a result of this horrible experience with Abby. He wants time where they're focused on him. And at any rate, he makes the demand that unless you do this, I'll kill myself. And he seems serious at that moment. We have to imagine that he is. I took that to be an illustration of Hegel because here, like the battle that Hegel imagines that produces the Master-Slave Dialectic, he really is willing to lay down his life for this recognition, however we characterize this recognition. And he gets it, and then, of course, there's later the sellout. But in that moment where he risks his own life to get recognition, do you see that as an illustration of the Hegel's Master-Slave Dialectic, or is it somehow a distortion of it?
So I think that's an excellent kind of a case of it. The difficulty in mapping Hegel onto the episode is that in the episode, Bing is already a slave. So in Hegel, you risk your life as a result of two people risking their lives against each other, and one person succeeding, one person then becomes a slave. So for Hegel, you risk your life, then there's a slavery. And then if the slavery proceeds farther and farther, so that one person is then dominating the other more and more, the slave eventually can't take it anymore. either the oppression gets too strong, or as you said in your monologue, the slave by working has empowered themselves and learned some skills and really doesn't need the master anymore. So for those two reasons, one, the extreme of fear,
Yes.
and two, the capacity for self-control, the slave can then rebel. And so in some ways in the story, Bing's threat to kill himself is the second one. It's the rebellion against slavery at the end of it.
I see.
But it does make you wonder, what was the relationship among people before that rebellion? What are all these people on the bicycles doing with each other? Do they recognize each other? Are they even living in a society together? Do they ever notice? They barely notice each other. The dumb guy on the bike insults the janitor. The woman 2 doors down looks at Bing longingly a couple of times, but there's no real dialogue. Maybe at lunchtime they converse a little bit. But what are these things?
It's so
they're
abstract.
kind of like fish in an ocean. You see, if you think about it that way, they're just kind of living organisms, just kind of going along.
Yes.
Then that rebellion of Bing does look like, no, it's a self-assertion for the first time. It's a refusal. It's the sacrifice yourself for the sake of being a self.
Okay.
And in some ways it looked like he was doing it to win back the woman. And so maybe there's a kind of intersubjectivity. There's a self and other relation he was trying to win back. But by the time he's getting ready to kill himself, it's almost like he's forgotten a woman.
Yeah, I think so. I think at that point, and that's why I took it to be an illustration of the Master-Slave Dialectic, although now I recognize the differences that you've illustrated. It's just a pure self-assertion, like not an egotistical self-assertion, but a pure desire that people wake up and that he's willing to risk his life so that others will wake up.
Right. So, like, that's an interesting story that, before the drama begins, when they're just bicycling, maybe we're supposed to think they're like fish in an ocean. They're barely conscious. Mm-hmm. And yet they've got this kind of semiotic society. They have a society all based on entertainment and these kind of minimal stories that are in the
Bother Guts or whatever the show is called.
Right. Yeah. A pie in the face or some kind of pornography. And so that makes it seem like there's a certain kind of entertainment that is the equivalent of unconsciousness.
Yes, right. Which this whole Living Wisdom podcast, at least in this first season, is introduced by Plato's Cave. And I find that's a really helpful way to talk about many films, but especially Black Mirror, because these are so often people trapped in a kind of cave. And 15 Million Merits is a really good illustration of that, where they're conscious, they're human beings, they're conscious, they use reason, to go back to the Aristotelian illusion earlier, even not in the full Aristotelian sense, but they're asleep in some ways. And as you say, their entertainment, it's waking, but it's also sleeping. And Bing comes as a kind of liberator, the kind who can release you from the cave. He fails, as we know.
Right.
He fails. I mean, do you want to talk about that failure?
Sure. It's very disappointing to the viewer, but maybe a lot of the Black Mirror episodes are ending with a disappointing. Yeah. Of course, we wanted him to rebel, but how could he have succeeded in the path that he was taking? So, to contrast with Marx, for Marx, rebellion takes place in a kind of group consciousness. Mm-hmm. So all the proletarians, all the factory workers oppressed in the same way are oppressed in the same place. And they're talking to each other about how bad factory life is. And the first rebellion comes out not with an individual act of sabotage or of suicide, but with a kind of a union.
Yes.
And so Bing doesn't have a union. He doesn't try to get other people on his side. He just does it quietly on his own at nighttime. And he obviously doesn't have a plan for changing society.
Right.
So it's spontaneous rather than organized, as Lenin would say. Spontaneous rebellion is not a revolution. So it's hopeless from the start. The best he can really succeed at is a suicidal moment. What would the judges do if they did agree with him? Okay, let's change the system. We won't have this show anymore. From now on, no more bicycling. Well, what's the solution supposed to be?
Yeah.
So it's hopeless from the beginning. We wish there would be something good, but at least we wish that in the end he would just kill himself. He promised he would kill himself. And maybe that would shake up at least one other person on a bike someplace.
Yeah.
But the fact that he just sells out at the end. So in a way, the movie maker is taking an anti-Marxist perspective. The movie maker is saying, those slaves who want to be free, if they were free, they would just become masters themselves and oppress other people.
Like Animal Farm.
They're like Animal Farm, exactly. They're hypocrites. They have no plan. There is no alternative society. They should maybe look for slightly better wages. That would be reasonable. But it's kind of the presumption that rebels are hypocrites.
That could be in the mind of the writer. Another possibility is that he's alerting us to the dangers of selling out. So another scenario that doesn't play out in this film is that he does commit suicide, and that doesn't start a revolution, but that does, as you say, alert one other person. If it starts waking up people, because you said, I guess, quoting Lenin, you need to have a union, you need to have an organized revolution. You can only have an organized revolution when you've got consciousness of what's going on, and this might be the first step towards achieving consciousness. In that Hegelian way, I guess, broadly speaking, of you got to give me recognition. And if I'm not worthy of recognition, then no revolution will ever work. Enough people have to start thinking, I'm free. I shouldn't have to ride bikes anymore, and I should want more than bother guts and pornography.
Right. This is a kind of a Sartrean point that says that you should try to gain your freedom, but in such a way that you leave behind a kind of trap door for the next person to find their freedom in the same way. So, but for Sartre, you're looking for creating a scenario that maybe one other person could follow, as opposed to Marx, where you're trying collectively to create a different kind of society. But the society that presented in the movie is so peculiar, so hard to figure out. Like you said, for a Hegelian, you try to think, well, how did the society get to be like this in the first place? Then we could understand and what the options are. But without any of the history, then we don't know. Is there nature somewhere on the planet? Are they on a planet or a spaceship? Where do they get their food from? Nobody lives with another person. Where do they get babies from? The woman said, my mother taught me this song. When did you live with your mother? Was it like 1,000 years ago? Was it just this generation that turned into, how would this happen in one generation? Why are they bicycling? What kind of a low-tech energy system they have, the bicycles? Are there like 100 people on the planet, or are there millions? And anyways.
Yeah, and those are all great questions. And well, it reminds me of, this is coming out of left field, but I have an episode on Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, and that's following this one. And so I could take any number of plays, but because I talked about the one, I'll talk about it now. If you think hard about Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, it doesn't add up. There are a lot of points at which things should happen that don't happen. And characters seem to know things that they shouldn't know, and so on. But it doesn't matter when you're watching it or even reading it. And it's only by reading it 10 times slowly that you start to notice these things. Now, 50 Million Merits is inferior to Oedipus Rex. I think we'll agree that you do notice the inferiorities of the kind that you're describing. But this is just a way of asking the general question that this is a parable. It's not like other Black Mirror episodes, like, say, Be Right Back, which is a rich human drama that, given a certain new technology, we can easily imagine unfolding between real human beings. This is more of a parable. It doesn't make sense. And yet, through this parable, important ideas, I think, are raised. Like alienation of labor, for example.
Right. No, that's fair enough. And it's just irritating people like me who see too many movies. And we start to look for flaws in the plot or, a boom in the frame. So it's irritating and kind of irrelevant. The movie shows us a premise. We're supposed to just accept that premise. But if we're supposed to also think, well, what does Bing have in mind? What does he think will be the result? And what, not just what is his motive, but what's the plan? What is his anticipation? Then it's pretty hard to figure.
Well, tell me what you think of what I figured for that. And I, in my own thinking, have used that Aristotelian distinction with which I began this episode, namely between activity, practice, and production. And that world that we're seeing, however coherent it may or may not be, is entirely a world of production. People are doing things to produce something else that doesn't mean anything to them. So, I mean, the bike is the best example. They're riding a bike to produce power, not for themselves, but, for whoever's in control of this place. And as a result, they are like automata. They're just part of this machine, and they act that way in the elevators and in their social interactions, such as they are. But when Bing's in that bathroom and he hears Abby singing that song, I take it as he's encountering an activity for the first time, an activity in the Aristotelian sense. Namely, here is something that is just beautiful. It doesn't its justification doesn't come because it leads to something else. And encountering beauty, encountering this kind of Aristotelian activity, which is valuable for its own sake, he wants people to see that as a way of giving them the experience that he's just had. Again, I'm thinking of Bing as a kind of liberator into the cave. He wants to. It's probably, excuse me, imagining too much. He's trying to liberate the entire society. But when I try and spell out what might motivate someone to give over his entire fortune to a near stranger, I mean, you can make a simple explanation. He's in love with her, but I take the love to be founded on this appreciation of this thing she's got. Now, I wanted to say earlier, you mentioned that she learned it from her mother, who learned it from her mother. And you're right. It's hard to imagine how she was raised by a mother in the society and where that happened and so on. But just taking it for the moment, that transmission of songs and customs in families, which of course we still have, is an escape from the marketplace. In other words, your parents give you things not because you give them money back, but they give you things because they love you and they want you to have a good life and they think these are good things. And as compared with good things, goods as we call them, that you get in the marketplace. So here's what I'm thinking of. I have a friend who, and this is a bit outdated now, but he just despised Martha Stewart. And I didn't really get it. But the reason he despised Martha Stewart is he said that she was marketing stuff that used to be transmitted through families. So recipes and ways of folding laundry and that sort of thing, that it was symbolic for him of how even the family has now been extracted out of what happened to the family has been extracted out of the family and put into the marketplace. Everything has been turned into a commodity. I don't remember which point I was trying to get at originally from that, but I mean, maybe I'm trying to pivot a little bit to Marx now and the notion of commodities. So you mentioned their entertainment networks in the 15 million merits world. One of the things that disturbs me that's portrayed there is the way, not just the bother guts and the pornography, but a couple bikes down, there's the redheaded guy who's a really silly character, and he's spending all of his money on hairdos for his avatar, for his avi as they're called. And you're, I'm sure, familiar with Marx's notion of commodity. Maybe you can explain to us what he thinks a commodity is, and then we can talk about whether the Marxian critique of commodification would apply to the hair of the avatar or the entire society. And I guess this gets back to what I was trying to say, that Abby's song is not a commodity in that sense. It's a glimmer of hope and beauty in a world that's been entirely alienated and commodified.
Right. So I think your account of commodity in the monologue was good. Marx is a materialist, and so things of value are created by putting your labor power into some material, some raw materials, and you increase the value of it, and then it has an exchange value, which is equivalent to the amount of labor time you put into it. And if it's useful, then people will buy it. And in the late 60s, people noticed that Marx's account of commodities are maybe too material based. And people should recognize that commodities, at least in the post Second World War era, are just as often or more often signifiers than they are material things. Yeah. And so there's a book called Philosophy in the Mirror of Production, which argues that Marx needs to be revised to think about commodities in terms of signs and meanings and social constructions, and that in effect people are paying more for the McDonald's name than they are for the piece of meat.
Yeah, you can really see this with, well, at least for me, handbags. So
Yeah.
I used to joke with somebody who was interested in those fancy Gucci handbags and so on. Well, does that mean, you're guaranteed nothing will fall out the bottom? Is that why they're worth $5,000?
Right.
No, it's because it's Gucci, and that has a certain symbolic value,
Right.
not about the quality of the thing.
Right. Personally, I like to buy designer shirts on eBay. So you get the name tag, but for like $14. So there's a workaround.
Yes.
Some of that. But anyways, I think you could call it a commodity world in the same way that you were describing it, that the people are selling the images rather than selling material things.
Yeah.
And that itself is a twist and something that Marx really didn't thoroughly anticipate. But it still could be given a Marxist interpretation.
He did have the notion of a commodity fetish, did he not?
Right.
Yeah. So in what ways was that limited?
I think he still thought that profits basically consist of taking raw materials, which have a certain value already, just because it took some labor power to get metals out of the earth, and then you put some time into turning it into a car, and then it's worth more because of the time that went into it. And the fetish, I think he thought, was a kind of secondary feature that was largely designed to create the ideology so that the workers wouldn't rebel at their mistreatment.
Yes.
Though it wasn't the core of the economic system,
Yeah.
whereas in this show, it is the core. It's really all they create. They really are virtually creating no commodities, although it's not clear somebody must be making their clothing and their food, but that's not in the story.
Yeah. I mean, does the fact that this society, such as it is, doesn't have a discernible leader, does that take it out of the realm of Marxist or?
Yeah, I wondered about that too. It sort of takes it out of the master-slave category because there's no master. So in a sense, everybody's giving recognition, but nobody's receiving it. Or this is kind of the Foucault picture of the world anyways, that in the earlier times, you had a monarch, you had somebody in charge, you had a master of the peasants, and there actually was a person up in the big house that received the goods. But in this society, there doesn't seem to be any of those people. Everybody kind of treats the world as if there's somebody that they're working for, but there's actually maybe nobody there. There's only a presumption of mastery.
Yeah. There may be no king, but what about the judges? Judge Hope, Charity, and Wraith. Judge Hope is the one who's kind of the Simon Cowell character from that TV show. If anybody has a claim to be the leader, it seems to be him. He determines who gets to go on the show, who wins, who loses, who gets funneled into the prestigious channels, and who ends up on the pornographic channel, and he controls the crowds with just small words.
Right.
Does he have a claim to be the king in that society?
Well, I don't really think so. Unless somehow behind the scenes he organized the whole setup, but he doesn't seem smart enough. He might as well just be an avatar. He's got routine, formulaic things that he says every time, and he's working as many hours as the contestants do. So it's more like maybe he's the manager of a factory floor, or the slave who's paid a little bit extra to whip the other slaves, but is kind of part of the in-slave culture, just kind of at the top level. They're the house slaves as opposed to the field slaves or something.
So the only glimpse we have behind the scenes is when Bing sells out, when Bing accepts the offer after his threat to commit suicide. He accepts the offer of having his own channel, and for half an hour a week he gets to make his quasi-revolutionary speeches. Then we see him, and I think in the final scene, making one of those speeches and then shutting down his computer or whatever, putting his glass shard into a case that has been specially designed to hold it and turn it into a commodity, and then pouring a glass of orange juice in this more luxurious apartment, which still has a virtual view of a forest, as I recall. So he's not the king, but he's become a kind of nobleman, if you like, in the society, that he's got a bigger place. He's able to drink the juice. And we can just imagine Judge Hope is having a bigger place with better juice, or more juice selection. Right. And so in what way is that still Foucauldian? How is he not, in fact, a master?
Yeah. he's still subject to all the things that the slaves are subject to. He just gets a little bit higher pay.
Yeah.
He himself is not going to last in that job very long because people are going to get tired of that show.
Okay.
And in a couple of months, he'll be back on the bicycle
Oh,
or maybe
okay.
worse.
Okay.
The woman who went into pornography, is she dead by now or what? Oh, how? She's just drugged out.
Yeah.
So the people are kind of given a little extra pay in order to perform a service which keeps the slaves more in line, but they themselves are in the same line. They don't have, I don't know what the orange juice is made of, but they don't actually get to go to the forest. They just get more pixels in the picture of the forest. So they too are only given the same entertainment, just a little bit higher up. Yeah. So it's like a wage slave who's paid a little bit higher wages in order to oppress the others.
It reminds me again of Plato's cave, where in the cave there are not only the prisoners who are viewing the wall, but there are the puppeteers who are giving them the illusion, and that makes them masters of those slaves, if you like. But they're still in the cave. They're still living a virtual life. They're not outside the cave, which is where true human happiness is found, according to Plato.
Yeah, in a way, it's like the jail wardens. So they look like they're in charge in a certain way, but they're subject to the same laws and the same unpleasant life that the prisoners are.
Yeah. And we just touched on the juice. It's, I think, a side topic, see if we can fold it in, of the role of drugs in this episode. So the most extreme example of this is before Abby goes on to perform, and this happens to all the contestants. She's forced to drink a drink. I thought it was called compliance, but I watched carefully this time. It's called Cuppliance, Cuppliance. And I'm guessing, I want to hear your thoughts on this, that this drink, I mean, obviously it's meant to make them comply with whatever the judge is saying. And I was thinking about what might the mechanism be? It seems that, I'm just speculating here, that what are the forces that get Abby to agree to go on the pornographic channel? She resists it at first, and then there are several strategies that are used successfully in the end to get her to do it. And the one that finally tips her over the edge is the whole crowd chanting, do it, do it, do it. I mean, she's intimidated too. Judge Hope keeps saying, well, you'll just end up on a bike. You didn't really want to be here. And then there's the Judge Charity, who's the female judge, who says, even I would want to see you in a pornographic channel. Although when Abby accepts the invitation, finally, you see Judge Charity with a tear in her eye, like she's cooperated in this commodification of Abby, and yet, probably regretting. At any rate, I thought maybe the drug is just a drug that makes us more susceptible to peer pressure. Did you have any thoughts about that drug or any of the other drugs that are mentioned?
Look, one thing that's noticeable is that Bing doesn't drink the drink.
Yes.
He's got like a crushed can. He pretends he's just had some.
Right.
But he folds just like everybody else. So the compliance drug wasn't really necessary. It's maybe makes you feel better about selling out. Yeah. But Bing is supposedly the most strong-willed person around, and he folds immediately, just like everybody else. So the drug wasn't necessary. Yeah. The woman,
does he fold immediately? He has to be persuaded, and I want to. Yeah. I'll let you finish your thought, but I want to make sure we don't miss it. Judge Hope persuades him, and he's pretty clever in the way that he persuades him. Do you remember what he says?
No, you remind me.
Yeah. So I've got it written down here. He says, Bing has this amazing speech, which I gather was mostly improvised by that actor. And Judge Hope says, I like your stuff. And of course, Bing says it's not stuff. And it's what Judge Hope is doing immediately is turning that speech, which I want to call again an Aristotelian activity. He's trying to tell the truth. This is getting outside the economy and just speaking about truth, just like the song from Abby was getting outside the economy. It was just beauty. And Bing says, it's not stuff. I think that's his way of saying it's not a commodity. And Judge Hope seems like he's going to change his mind, says, yeah, it's truth. But then he says, your truth, but truth nonetheless. So it's so clever because Bing is trying to assert value that's not bought or sold, and it looks like Judge Hope is going to go along with it. And then instead of saying, you're right, it's truth, it can't be bought and sold, he says, it's your truth. He relativizes it. And insofar as it's your truth, then you can sell it to other people, and then it can become their truth. And truth is just like an avatar hairdo that we trade with each other for services.
But I sort of thought that was something you might like, since it's an activity. It's truth as an activity rather than truth as a correspondence with reality. Because the the woman, Abby's song, it's not like it's really that good. It's not Bach. It's not, the best of punk. It's not the best of anything. It's a sentimental song, but it's sung with a kind of authenticity, a kind of a heart, or it was sung, without an audience in mind. So it had that kind of pure activity form. Yeah. So he's saying, your truth, it doesn't matter. It's your truth. That's an activity. You're doing it for its own sake, true or not true. People want to see that authenticity. So he's kind of letting him have the job that he didn't let Abby have, but they're both kind of authenticity things. But by the time Bing is doing it on the program, he says the same kind of thing, but at the end of it, he puts his thing away and he smiles or smirks or whatever that is. He watches his digital forest. So by that point, he's certainly sold out.
Yeah.
But anyways, he didn't need the compliance drug for it. He was persuaded by the trickery, or he was happy to get out of the bicycling, or he just didn't know what was going on. He's not smart enough to really think about it. Abby in particular is not a smart person. And, she didn't really think about what are the alternatives. She's told, you could have this pornography life, lots of money in it. If she thought about it a minute, she said, wait a minute, that's not very pleasant. I think I'll go back to the bicycle. And I also wonder about, this is another thing, but I wonder about whether Bing shouldn't have felt embarrassed or guilty about having sent Abby into the pornographic life. Do you think so?
Well, I don't know that I even have evidence for it. Maybe I was just projecting. But he rages as he sees what's about to happen, and then they pull him off stage, and then we know that he's back in his despairing life. And there's so much rage there that could be anger at what happened to her, but it also could be a way of trying to undo his own guilty conscience for what he did to her.
That's possible. Yeah.
So I think there's a little bit more to be said about the role of drugs and even medicine in the society. And as with the whole episode, we only get hints. But it's not only that the people on stage are given this drink compliance to, compel them to do what the judge is saying. Actually, if I just interrupt for a moment there, in an earlier episode of this podcast, I talk about Gorgias's encomium of Helen. And Gorgias is a sophist, and he has a theory of how speech works. And this is in the context of his effort to defend Helen from the charge that she destroyed Troy. And he says, well, it wasn't her fault. She was either brought there by Paris, or the gods made her do it, or in the list he says she was persuaded by Paris. And then he goes in and describes how words work, and he says words are like little particles that come out of your mouth. He's got an atomistic theory, and he doesn't really believe in atomism. He's a sophist. He's just using the theory to sound persuasive. Words are like little particles that come out of your mouth, and they go into the ear of the listener, and it's a materialistic theory where it sort of bats around in your brain, and just like being raped, where somebody grabs you and pulls you away in that ancient sense of rape, by main force controls you. Words are just a subtle way of main force, of controlling somebody. So the compliance drink is the raw drug that they give, but then Judge Hope's words are like sophistic words. He's able to take someone like Abby, who has this beautiful song, or Bing, who has this truth he wants to speak, and instead of just drugging them and making them go along, he uses words to kind of manipulate their mind in such a way that they go along with it. So there's that. There's also Judge Wraith says, when he's trying to persuade Abby to go on his porn channel, he says, you don't have to worry about, I don't know if he says shame or how you'll feel, because we've got drugs that'll make it so that you'll only enjoy it. Right. So that's an odd recognition in front of the entire audience that this is in fact going to be painful for her. They're all imagining like, oh, you get off the bikes and wow, you get to be in, what does he say? You get to be with hot guys all the time or something like that. There's an implicit recognition. No, it's actually awful, because when you're on the bike, they're not giving you drugs to deal with the bike, as far as we know. But what they do give you, you can buy, Abby says, when Bing offers her the money so that she can go on the show, at that point, I think it's 12 million merits. She says, why don't you use your money for, and then she lists some things that you can buy. And one of them is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. She says you can buy basically a private therapist. It'll be an avatar of a therapist who will appear in your room, and then throughout the night implant in your mind strategies for proper thinking. And again, everything is schematic, but maybe it takes drugs to get people to go on pornography. It takes drugs for people to be persuaded by the judges. It takes the subtle speech of Judge Hope to be persuaded by him. But even in the rest of the society where everyone's alienated and presumably anxious and depressed, therapy is being offered as a way. So I took that to be a critique of, life in our capitalist society where there's so much alienation and so much commodification. How do we do it? How do we keep going?
Right.
And we need the drugs and we need the therapies to make it all function.
Well, that's good. If I'm remembering, Lucretius has an account like that. The words come out as particles, and there's some line which is totally ridiculous, but some line that's why when it's windy, the particles all get kind of mixed up and they come into your mind, and you misunderstand what a person has said. Like it's the wind rather than the interpretation of the words. But the most effective words would be the words that come kind of straight into your mind without the mediation of the environment in between. And so in this case, it's without conversations among people. So the words come at you from the screen and nobody is talking about them. You don't discuss it. Nobody criticizes anything. So the words come kind of straight into your mind from the headphones or from the speakers or something. And so that's the effect of the drugs, is that it's the immediacy of it, the cognitive therapy, that you don't even sit across the room from somebody, but it goes right into your head.
Yes.
So
like a hypnosis.
Right.
Which goes back to the idea that everybody's asleep. They're all in this hypnotic trance.
And there's no critical distance, and there's no other people to help you interpret things. So everything functions like a drug if there's no intermediaries between you and that.
Yeah.
The food you were mentioning, like the chicken nuggets. Bing doesn't like the chicken nuggets. He'd rather have an apple.
Yes.
Although I think he says at one point, we don't even know where the apple comes from.
It's from a Petri dish, I think he says.
Either there's a lot of salt and sugar in it, like in junk food, and so you like it even though you don't like it, or it's a kind of artificial pleasure that's going straight into your, sugar receptors, whatever that is. Yeah. Or it's a kind of semiotic of it. So you go to lunch. Lunch means nuggets, and so you're happy to get the nuggets because that's what lunch means. So the words that don't have meaning but are part of a kind of
junk food of the mind.
Junk food of the mind. There you go.
Yeah. He's got a theory of the vicious cycle of the food. That you ride your bike, you get hungry. The sugary foods or the salty foods, I forget which he's focusing on, you're drawn to those because those seem like they'll satisfy your hunger. You eat them, but they leave you, first of all, more hungry. You want to eat more of them, but also you start gaining weight, and then you've got to get back on the bike. You've got to ride more. You get hungrier. You want to eat more of them. And it seems to be a little pet theory that might explain why it is that these people who are riding bikes all the time, some of them are getting fat and getting kicked off the bike and put into the yellow suits and turned into objects of ridicule. Because there's that one guy on the other side who coughs. It seems like he's having heart trouble, and then the next day he's been replaced. In fact, that's how Abby ends up there, is that his bike is vacant and then she comes in. But it's a mystery. Why are these people who are exercising all day? Why would they get fat? And it looks like Bing has got this theory that it's the food. They're giving you such bad choices in food that it's almost inevitable, unless you make this deliberate resistance, such as he's making to eat apples. Sounds like he said he used to eat the junk food, and then he realized, he took a critical distance. He saw the vicious cycle he was in, and then he switched his eating habits.
Well, exercise itself, people think of it sometimes as a drug. Either it's an empowering drug, it makes you more confident, or makes you more aggressive, or become addicted to the exercise. People talk about exercise.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I like your idea about the words in the episode from the entertainment, for example, as junk food for the mind. So, you go to entertainment to enjoy yourself, and those characters, we have to presume that entertainment being so thin and vulgar, go and they walk away not feeling good. And so you don't feel good. And what's the solution to not feeling good? Get entertained. So you watch more entertainment. And they wouldn't be conscious of that. Otherwise they'd stop if they had any self-control. But that their slavery gets deepened with the things that they're being offered as the solutions, as they're working in order to get this stuff. But the stuff is actually what's keeping them enslaved.
Well, I also like the idea that the entertainment is free, But if you want to turn the sound off or not watch it, then you pay for that. So there's all kind of recognition. This is entertainment. It's pleasure, but it's pleasure you don't want. And so
it's horrible.
It's pretty horrible. In a way, it's less subtle than the current world. So the current world offers you many, many kinds of entertainment. You can turn off one device and listen to the other. It's much more effective. They sell more ads our way than their way. So,
although you go into an airport or a bank sometimes, and there's the screen, you can't get away from it.
Right. The quasi-public spaces, those are the worst. But that's the old style. Eventually, everyone will bring. My kid brings his phone to the airport. He doesn't listen to what's on there. He chooses his own, and he has tens of thousands of choices now on the phone. And so I think that'll be the norm. So the idea of imposing one form of entertainment, that's a bit archaic.
Yeah, true. Although, we get the 10,000 choices, but we all end up watching cat videos on YouTube. So,
Well, I don't watch cat videos.
They're not so bad. But the critique of capitalism, that it offers all these choices, but and you can pick any one of them, but they're not real choices. You go to the supermarket, there are 100 breakfast cereals, but where's the choice for revolution? That's not going to be one of the choices.
There's no choice for revolution. But again, the Foucault idea is that in the old societies of control, you would control people by conformity, or by preventing people from getting their true desires. But the modern societies of control have learned that you can give people their true desires. You can really give people their pleasures and control them that way. So you can have, a million different channels, one for everybody. There doesn't need to be conformity. You don't need to have one of the breakfast cereals. You could have quinoa, or you could have, coconut rice, or you could really have anything. But the economic system is going to sell everything to everybody, including the smallest niche. And so you're controlled, even though you're highly differentiated. And the desire is really going to come from you.
Well, you take the TV channels, 100 TV channels, and I don't have a TV, but if I go to a hotel, I'll start flipping through them, and none of them will be interesting to me.
Right.
And then I start thinking, well, it presents you choice, and people who are, in the TV world, and they like these 4 channels, but not these 96 others. That makes them different from other people who like the 96 others. But then again, they're all participating in the absorption of this, to my mind, empty shell of entertainment. Again, we're talking here about a TV show, Black Mirror. So there's very, very high quality television available, especially in the last decade or two. But when you put Black Mirror up against what's on a typical hotel TV, I think it's like a drop in the ocean.
But that's why TV's on its way out. It's because its 100 channels are too similar to each other. And so you could watch anything on YouTube. You can watch radical extremists on YouTube. You can watch revolutionaries. You can watch chess videos. You can, put up your own podcast and listen to yourself. So there really is an unrestricted choice, and the question is whether even that creates a society of control.
I would think so. Getting back to your earlier point about how Bing's protest is futile because he doesn't, and I think you quoted Lenin again, doesn't have an organized plan for revolution. How can you organize a plan for revolution when everybody's watching their own YouTube channel?
Right.
There's no common language and voice. So the control wouldn't be through getting them all to think certain things. It would be in dispersing them so widely that there's no solidarity.
Right. And like on both Hegel's account and Marx's account, the reason that rebellion eventually occurs is that the situation for the slave gets worse and worse. So the master needs the recognition of the slave, knows that the slave doesn't really have the status to give him proper recognition because he's not worthy. So he needs more recognition per hour. Spend more time bowing to me and give me more of your products. And for Marx's theory of capitalism, the profit, a stable amount of profit is not good enough for a capitalist organization. The profit has to keep increasing, which means the wages have to keep decreasing and things get worse and worse. So for both of them, it's not, the oppression is not stable. It increases in its severity.
Why does Marx think that it's necessarily unstable? I forget exactly how you put it, but that the production must increase. It can't stay the same.
Yeah, in order to get investors,
Yes.
you have to be the company that's increasing profits all the time.
Okay.
A steady rate of profit, 4% every year, is
Okay.
not going to get the investors. You have to get
Okay.
up to 4.2 next year and then 4.3 next year.
Okay.
And so there's a pressure for the wages to go down. Because for Marx, the only way there's profit is if workers work on a commodity, the commodity has certain value, and you're going to pay the workers less than the value that they put into the commodity.
Yes.
So profit is not made by increasing prices. That's just inflation. Profit is not created by using cheaper raw materials. That's making products that are worth less. Profit is created by workers producing products. You sell the products for the actual value of the product. There's no gouging of the customer, but you make the profit by paying the worker less than they put into it.
Mm-hmm.
So profit is created by lowering wages. And if you want to make more profit, you have to lower the wages more.
Mm. And the stupid capitalists would lower them so low that then the workers have nothing to lose.
That's right.
In a revolution.
Right. In a way, that's the inherent nature of capitalism. You have to keep lowering the wages. Otherwise, capitalism becomes static. So it's kind of the inherent dynamic of capitalism. It's not just the stupid capitalist, but it's true that modern capitalists have realized, you have to keep a certain standard of living to prevent the rebellion, or you have to put the cheapest workers, do that in the Philippines where you don't care if they rebel or not, but in your own country, keep the wages okay, minimum wage acceptable, and plus the ideology of entertainment, which distracts people from what's actually happening.
And this is now just getting into Marx, about whom you know much more than I do. Has that logic, that argument, maybe in broad strokes, been invalidated by changes in the economy in the late 20th century, especially where in the 19th century you had these two classes, the capitalist class and the proletariat, and the proletariat didn't own anything, they just had their labor, and especially the unskilled ones who couldn't sell it at a premium. And the capitalist class who own the factories. But in the late 20th century, you get the democratization of stock options so that the workers, certainly this happened to my generation. I had friends who didn't get into graduate school even though they wanted to. They ended up working for this non-entity company called AOL, and they ended up getting really rich very quickly because part of working at AOL was the promise that you get the stock options. And AOL eventually was superseded and flamed out, but not before they made a couple $1 million. When a company gives its workers stock options, that starts to elide the distinction between owners and workers, does it not?
Only a little bit. So I think between the 1950s and 70s, there was an increase in the middle class in most Western countries.
Yes.
But since the 70s, the real wages of the middle class have gone way down.
Mm-hmm.
The real wages of factory workers have kind of collapsed.
Yeah.
And the gap between rich and poor in Western countries has increased. So I think from the 1970s onwards, it looks like Marx was right again.
Okay.
The stock auctions is one thing. It kind of commits the worker to the success of the capitalist organization. It's kind of a way of keeping rebels from rebellion, because now they, if they succeed in overturning the company, maybe they themselves will lose. But that was also a trick in the late 1920s before the Depression hit, when the banks realized there's a problem with the value of our stocks. And their solution was in part to pay their workers not just in cash salaries, but in stocks. And so they deliberately transferred stocks they knew were going to have no value to the workers. So sometimes it's a trick to pay in stock options.
I see.
But in rare cases of companies or industries that are having a quick advance, then of course getting stock options for those ones is a huge boon.
Yeah, so I guess my point really just applies to bubbles like the tech boom in the late 90s, which my friends were fortunate enough to benefit from while I was reading Aristotle, making a stop into graduate school.
But in an episode of the Black Mirror, the people don't seem to be that concerned that their poverty is increasing. They don't seem to be thinking in terms of poverty. They don't except for Bing, nobody really seems to mind that much that they're on the bicycles. They don't complain about it. Yeah. They gripe, but that's not the same as complaining. It's not like they think, oh, why aren't those rich people riding bikes? Doesn't occur to them.
Especially because there aren't rich people, or at least the only rich people that we see are the three judges and then Selma and a few people who have succeeded on the Hot Shot show. You get the same thing in American society. Much more complex, of course, but that you go to a grocery store in a poor neighborhood here where we live in Pittsburgh, and a discount grocery store where at best middle class people are going to be shopping, at most I should say. And what are the checkout racks full of? Magazines of the rich and famous. And there doesn't seem to be any resentment of these people. That is to say, on behalf of the poor against the rich and famous, but rather a kind of idolatry.
Right. In the show, there isn't even really competition among the bikers. So, some of them want to buy the next, hat for their avatar. But there doesn't seem to be any resentment, or I've got to work harder so I can have more than that guy. There isn't even that competition that supposedly exists.
Yeah. There's a leaderboard in the background.
Is there?
Yeah, but you're right. It doesn't play any role in the drama. Yeah. We talked a bit about revolution and how it just doesn't seem possible. And I know you are a student of film. I should have said that when I introduced you, that film is one of your expertises as well, which is one of the many reasons that I invited you on the show. Are you familiar with other films where people are cast in similar roles, that they're oppressed and they seek a revolution and they succeed perhaps in a way that doesn't happen in this episode or go ahead.
Success in the movies is always a little bit ambiguous, because if you succeed after a 2-hour movie, it seems fake. How could you, it's a kind of deus ex machina, great solution with only 2 hours of preparation. And if you don't succeed, then it's a tragedy. And so it's kind of hard to get it going. The movie Network from the 70s had the newscaster who gets gradually upset with the news he's reporting. The news is becoming too much entertainment for him. So on air, he says one day, I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore.
Not going to take it anymore. Yeah.
And he threatens to jump out the window,
like Bing.
Like Bing. And I think in the end he says, tomorrow I'm going to jump out the window during my broadcast. He doesn't do it the next day, so he gets huge viewership. And in the end, it kind of fizzles. I can't even remember in the end, does he jump out or not? It doesn't really matter so much.
Very much like Bing.
It's very much like Bing.
Yeah, his show is going to fizzle out as you predicted.
Right.
Yeah.
There are movies. I watched a Cuban movie the other day called Cumbite. It's a low-budget Cuban movie from like 1968. And the guy who goes to a small town, he realizes that rich people are controlling the water supply, and he goes and finds some water for the poor people to get their farms back. But then somebody, not really for political reasons, but for resentment reasons, kills him. And the movie ends with his death. But the townspeople have learned his enthusiasm, his motivation, and maybe we think they're gonna come up with something themselves afterwards. So it couldn't be him. It's like a Moses. He leads people to a solution and leaves it for the next people to take over. And of course, there are both Marxist and, for that matter, fascist movies where people in a difficult situation learn to get together and to make a mass movement. I don't know how convincing those are as works of art or as they're somewhat propagandistic. But some of them are good movies. There are movies where people get together and start a movement.
It reminds me of the Christian story, because I think it's Judas in the Christian story. I know it's Judas who sells to the political leaders in Jerusalem the knowledge of where Jesus will be, betrays him with a kiss. But I believe the reason that he does this is that he wants a political revolution, and he realizes Jesus is not going to provide it. And if it isn't Judas, that was an expectation that the Messiah would liberate the Jews from the Romans. And here's this Jesus who's called himself the Messiah, and Passover has come, and he's not fomenting a revolution. And it gets to this question that we've raised in the person of Bing, who can't start a revolution. It's just not possible in that society. Everyone's just too asleep. And so what might you do with the long-term goal of liberating the people in the society? The first step has to be to liberate their consciousness, to wake them up. Even if it's just one person who's going to wake up, 2 people is going to wake up 4 people, and so on. And that's part of the understanding of the Christian story among Christians, is that a worldly revolution is superficial. In the animal farm way, you're just going to replicate the problem just with a new ruling class. What's required for it to be effective at all is going to be a revolution in consciousness. And so Bing is a kind of Christ figure. Any response to that thought?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
A failed one, obviously, because it gets co-opted.
Yeah, that could be. It's very different from Marx. So I actually think Marx's account of how a revolution could get started is a plausible one. So the account is that as long as the exploited people are peasants and they're each kind of off on their own farm, and they don't, the distances are great and they can't travel much and there's no communication, then they can each one be ready to rebel, but there's nobody to rebel with and no chance. But it's when an economic system puts a lot of people together in a factory. So it drags a lot of people into the same place and they're all doing the same thing. And they have even the shortest lunch hour. They're talking to each other and griping about it. So A, you put a lot of people together with the same issue. And B, they run every part of the factory. And so they realize we don't need the owners anymore. We're running the factory anyways, so we get rid of them. Unlike the peasants who are only tilling the soil, but not managing the transfer of agricultural goods from one town to the other. The workers are doing all the jobs.
So think about this world. They're all in that huge cyclotorium, or whatever we want to call it. They're in a very tight space. So they eat lunch together.
Right.
And if the conceit of the film is correct, that they're generating the power for now, I think it's called, then they have control of the means of production, if you like. And so it's ripe for revolution if they realize there's something wrong.
Right.
And I think that's what entertainment and drugs and the CBT are doing, is they're keeping them from recognizing that something's wrong. As you say, nobody's really complaining. They're all pretty passive except for Bing.
Right. So on the one hand, who's in charge of the whatever kind of wires or cables are transferring the energy from the bicycle to someplace else? Right. Somebody must be doing that in the next room. So maybe they're just keeping the different specialized groups of workers away from each other so that they don't know how to run the factory together. The bicyclers can rebel. What are they going to do? They can barely leave their own apartments. So it's partly that, and then partly also the writers have created not really human responses for the characters in order to keep the conceit going. So in the real world, if it was people like you and me on the bicycles, we'd be complaining. So it doesn't matter what the entertainment is going to be, we would complain. So they had to write a lack of dialogue into the characters in order to make them not rebel. In the real world, maybe they would have rebelled.
Yeah, although isn't that to underestimate Foucault's point about the way in which patterns of thought get propagated, so that the enslavement doesn't have to be through whips and chains, but can be just through media, for example, and the kind of entertainment. And that's why I want to return and defend Abby's song. You said it's not that good. I grant you it's not Bach, but I don't think the audiences in that world are ready for Bach. I think that would just sound like noise to them. It's a sentimental song. You're right. It's sung with authenticity by her, and maybe not even that well. I mean, when she appears on the show, voice is cracking and so on. That gives an authenticity to it, but it's not. She's not technically proficient. But the content matters. We haven't talked about the content of that song, and I won't be able to quote it exactly, but I think it's something like that. She has pity for anyone who doesn't know what love is. I think she says, people. They see you blame me, they see you shame me, and I still love you. People pity me, think I'm a kind of slave to you, but I pity them because that shows they don't know what love is. And that's what Bing gets as well. So she's singing about your life is worthless unless you know what love is. I pity you. Maybe worthless is too strong a word, but I pity you. And Bing, through hearing that song, learns what love is. And again, I see that as he's recognizing for the first time the value of something outside the commodity exchange that has been schematized in this episode.
Yeah, I see that from his point of view. And from his point of view, maybe he really should have just been satisfied hearing it in the bathroom. That's the song for its own sake. He should say to you, why don't you sing that in the bathroom every day? We'll all come and listen to you in the bathroom. So, putting her on the stage is kind of... But...
Yeah, what does he want by putting her on the stage exactly? He wants other people to feel how he felt, because that's a noble motive. So
that would be a noble motive. But you'd have to really misunderstand the nature of the show to think that that's what's really going to come across on the show. But anyways, maybe that's what he wanted. But he felt it. I think you're right about that. I don't know if she felt it, because who's she in love with? At least he's in love with her. She's kind of indifferent to him. She's
She's being charmed. She holds his hand at one point as
Yes.
they're walking into the studio
Yeah.
for the hot shots.
Right. But she doesn't love him with that passion that the
No,
song
not yet.
has.
So soon, right? It's such a schematic
Right.
relationship.
Uh-huh.
Although I take one sign of her genuine motive to be when she's brought into that studio and very implausibly immediately drafted onto the show, whereas people have been waiting for weeks,
Right.
stretching and so on. And one says it's just not fair, and she ends up being terrible. The Abby is put in front of a camera right before she goes on stage and asked to say, "I want to be as famous as Selma one day." First, the person says, "Do you want to be as famous as Selma one day?" And she goes, "I guess." And then she said, "Well, can you just say that into the camera?" And then she reluctantly says, "I want to be as famous as Selma one day." I think she's uncomfortable in that moment because I think she's not really doing it to be famous.
Right.
She, not with the clarity perhaps that Bing loves that song and sees what it represents. I think she feels like there's something there of value for its own sake. It's not about fame. It's not about money. It's not about getting off the bike and so on. It's, here's a beautiful thing and I want to share it with other people to liberate them as well. And again, I think it's important that it was taught to her by her mother, and it was taught by her mother, that the family that's just gestured at here isn't part of the marketplace.
Right. Well, this is a little bit funny to connect it with the content in that case. So if you're singing, I have this great love experience, and which love experience was that? Well, my mother sang me this song. So you're really, it's an homage to your mother, or it's a desire, but the actual love is not really the topic of the song.
Well, I took it, now that you mention it, that she's expressing her love for her mother and her mother's love for her grandmother. I mean, it's cast as romantic love with a man or another woman we don't know. But again, that it's outside the marketplace.
Sometimes I'm more cynical than the show.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Sometimes with the revolutionary topic, I'm less cynical than the show. It turns out.
It's reminding, when we talk about the content of the song, it's reminding me again of that point about Gorgias that's really made such a big impression on me in my career. That this song has a power, and it can control your mind. Control is probably too strong. It can influence you to do something as dramatic as what Bing does. He just hears the song and he wants to give up his entire savings.
I did wonder, speaking of cynicism, is 50 million credits a lot of money? Or is it not very much?
Well, it takes him, I think, like 6 months to earn
6 months. Yeah. But on minimum wage, he still has to pay for his apartment. He's skipping lunches and working some extra hours. What would a person on minimum wage be able to save in 6 months? Maybe $5,000.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm thinking in the $5,000 range.
Okay. Yeah, and he has to skimp on toothpaste. You see him, he use his finger to just draw out a little drop of toothpaste because they're paying for every dollop. And he has to, for me, the worst part is he can't turn off the pornography and the bother guts shows. He's just subjected to those constantly. He covers his ears, and then that high-pitched screaming noise makes him...
Yeah, that's the worst.
Yeah, it's really the worst. Like there's no place for mental freedom at all. Society has really just trapped you. Well, are there other topics that you'd like to discuss? I feel like we've covered everything that
that covers the list of things that I have.
Okay, well, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show, John.
Thank you. It was really delightful.